Welcome to our virtual event hosted by WBAF USA as part of our annual education series, which has already included a wide range of topics revolving around cybersecurity for entrepreneurship, managing innovation risk, novel funding instruments in the digital economy, and the risk of the space economy. Today's discussion is dedicated to exploring novel approaches to risk governance in this phygital era, where we experience a blending and at times even fusion of the physical and virtual worlds. Today, we're honored to have our guest speaker, David Koenig. He's president and CEO of the DCRO Institute, as well as WBF USA Advisory Board member. Thank you for joining us, David. It's a privilege to have you with us.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I am pleased to be with you because of the work you're putting in so many different fronts, but I think around the governance and risk governance of some of these new technologies, the work that you're doing is really invaluable. So my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. I was thinking about how to explain to our broader audience that is maybe not as immersed into the risk ecosystem, why we believe that risk governance is essential to our mission at WBF for entrepreneurs and investors alike. So please allow me to briefly share that in this new economy, where we're experiencing fast-paced new adoption of frontier technologies, and of course, a high volatility of the economy, risk governance is critical for entrepreneurs and investors alike. As technology-driven entrepreneurship reshapes all industries and transforms or gives rise to new economies, traditional risk management is not going to cut it. And it demands not only new financial instruments, new business models, new ethics programs, but also new risk governance. The need for these innovative approaches to have already at the board level appropriate risk governance is crucial in order to have the positive trickle-down effect that we wish throughout the C-suite and the rest of the organization. Aligned with this imperative is our mission at the World Business Angel Investment Forum, an affiliated partner of the G20 Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. WBF is dedicated to fostering global collaboration, empowering economic development, and championing innovative financial instruments for startups, scale-ups, innovators, entrepreneurs, and SMEs. With a commitment to gender equality and women's participation in all sectors, WBF invites engagement in their global efforts to facilitate access to finance, promote financial inclusion, and catalyze job creation and social justice. Embracing risk governance within this mission ensures that entrepreneurs and investors navigate these uncertainties with resilience, driving sustainable growth in this tech-driven but human-led ecosystem. Now, please allow me to share just a few brief highlights about David before I'm asking him to share some of the highlights of his recent book and past books. So David is the award-winning author of Governance Reimagined, Organizational Design, Risk, and Value Creation, as well as the Board Member's Guide to Risk. During his executive career, David created corporate risk management programs at 3 different companies and has managed complex financial portfolios in excess of tens of billions of dollars in size. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Risk Management in Financial Institutions, is the founder of the Directors and Chief Risk Officers Group, DCRO, the DCRO Institute, and a co-founder of the Professional Risk Managers International Association. He brings a particular skill as a qualified risk director and internationally recognized risk governance expert, helping companies navigate the intersection of risk-taking, innovation, and governance. Today, we asked David to join us to share deeper insight into his award-winning reinvention of governance, the networked and distributive governance of a commons model that was developed in 2010 and informed his first book, Governance Reimagined, which was published in 2012. The concept that he proposed in 2010 is more timely than ever as we're currently navigating this highly dynamic and high-risk, highly volatile phygital era. And we are interested to hear a little bit from you, David, about what drove you to think about that type of model at that time, and how did you bring it to fruition?
Well, I loved, by the way, hearing you talk about the importance of governance and risk governance in this era. And I would argue again that it's any era, but as you talked about, there's a lot that's in motion right now. So the question about where this idea came from, or the need maybe to write a book about governance, has a lot of different inputs to it. And I'll try to be brief about it. But I've benefited from working in some really fast-moving places. I've worked at companies that were startups. I've worked at companies that were 100 years old. I've worked and helped build organizations literally from zero to where they were global organizations. And I've also been in places where there were governance problems. And so I've seen how even old companies, even companies that are 100 years old, can be innovative. I've seen how new companies can have problems or can get to places where there are problems that come about. And a lot of this comes down to just generally governance. So having had these experiences, most of which thankfully were very positive, in the early 2000s, there was some emerging literature on value being created through governance. And even when I was out talking to people in Wall Street about this, even just after the financial crisis or towards the end of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, it was a really foreign concept to people. They were saying, how can governance create value? And so in my mind, if they're asking that question, that meant that the story really hadn't been told well. And there was so much interesting work going on around the psychology of risk and how we take risk well, that one final component to all of my thinking on this came together when someone introduced me to complexity science. And I started to study complex adaptive systems. And it was the missing piece in everything that I had been thinking about. And you probably understand this through your writing. When everything comes together, you feel like you need to put it down. You want to put it into a book. And so that's where this came about. You know, I think the work that I always say that almost everything I do is from other people that I put together maybe in a different way. And that's what I thought was happening with this book when I wrote it, is that trying to take a lot of ideas from disparate areas of research, practice, and put them together in a way that people hadn't before. And so that's where it came about. It was finally having a whole puzzle come together and feeling like there was a good story to tell.
So you leveraged a lot of collective intelligence.
You know, and it happens more and more, but absolutely. And there's, you know, there was someone who just connected with me on LinkedIn you know, we haven't met yet, but one of the things that she does is to help people understand the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on collaboration. And I was lecturing to a group of students at Ohio State maybe a month ago or so. And at the end of the lecture, I said to them, a lot of people are talking to you about artificial intelligence. I will tell you this, you have no sense, nor do any of us in this room, of the magnitude of how this collaboration is going to change the way in which you work and study, learn, and innovate. And if I can't give you any other advice, it would be to spend time understanding how that's going to happen. But I think very few of us, I would say you're probably one of the ones who does understand this, but I think very few people understand the change that's taking place right now and will take place very quickly in terms of how we work together.
Describe to our audience, once you had the concept and then you had the book out, how did leaders react to it? Was there a good acceptance, or were they like, you know, I don't want to change my way, and they didn't truly understand, so then you had to embark on a journey to translate the learnings in the book to practice? So yeah, share with our audience a little.
I think anytime you write something new, you have to translate. But, you know, I don't know if you remember the first time you put something out that was years of your work and you put it out for other people to judge. It's, you know, especially on the first book, it's one of those feelings where you're just not sure if they're going to come back and shred your ideas and say, look, this is maybe one of the worst things I've ever read. I was a bit stunned at how nice the feedback was and how positive the feedback was. And I'll just use, in the book, there are a number of the endorsements at the beginning of it. But you asked about some of the traditional governance people. There's a gentleman named Bob Monks, who is considered the father of modern corporate governance. Bob gave it a resounding endorsement. And Bob actually said it reminded him of days studying out at the Santa Fe Institute. So that was nice to see. Knut Scher, who used to run the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, also gave it a really glowing review. And they were, one of the earliest investment funds to be looking at good governance. John Koenig, who was one of the founders of the International Corporate Governance Network, also gave it a very glowing review. And so when I started to see these come in, I mean, there's a great feeling, right? I don't mean to sound falsely modest on it, but it's humbling to have people like this say nice things about the work that you've done. I think the challenge is always going to be there for people who aren't thinking about new ideas or aren't thinking about a particular subject, that when you bring something that's very new in, it doesn't fit into the paradigm of what they know. And so it takes work to move to a new paradigm. And so, as you had said, this idea was first out in 2010. It's been kind of interesting to see some people who've read the book lately, so 13 years later. And one person said, oh, some of these ideas aren't that new. And I thought, that's great. I love to hear that, because they were new 13 years ago. So I'm glad to see that others are maybe seeing these in other places. But, I also get plenty of people who read it and say, this is still really timely. And so I think the book's got some endurance to it. I'm flattered by the feedback that I got, and that makes me happy, because how much work goes into writing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the way I understand it is that you took 3 models and combined them. Of course, more experience, but it's at the foundation 3 models that you're leveraging in your new approach. So if leaders read the book today and they're wondering how can they combine all of the elements that you are bringing to the table with all the other elements that they're being asked to do, from cybersecurity, ethics, integrating DEI, integrating ESG, making sure that they're aligned with the net zero economy. Maybe describe to them, how does this actually fit in, and how can it maybe act as an enabler? It doesn't have to be this or the other, but maybe an enabler or a catalyst so that they do the other things better.
Yeah, well, and throw in geopolitics, financial issues, conflict within countries, conflict between countries, the list of things that are going on that challenge us to think beyond today, that put our minds in this really defensive model are probably more than any of us have felt in their lives, and probably is the least it's going to be over the next 10, 20 years at least. We're going to continue to face this stuff. So one of the things that is, I think, really important to understand is that this model is actually freeing. So it's not constricting. And that's really critical. So we think about complex systems that fail. They often fail because they're too rigid. There's the law of requisite variety in order for complex systems to adapt. So we try to create a model that fosters freedom and fosters this notion of pushing risk management to the same place where risk is being originated. That creates, in essence, what is a big venture portfolio. And you can think of the venture portfolio being a portfolio of ideas. It could be a portfolio of capital. It can be like a traditional venture capital investment. But we're really talking about bringing capital in all sorts of different forms, allocating it out to places where innovation and risk-taking can happen in a framework that sets boundaries and parameters and vision, but allows people to be free. And to be free allows you to respond. It allows you to respond to opportunities. It allows you to respond to things that are going differently than you expected. Whereas if you have these old style rigid architectures, top-down architectures, they can't respond quickly enough. Whether it's an issue of, in a hierarchical structure, message compression. If the CEO says, or the board says to do something, the CEO says to do something, by the time it gets to the people who are working with the customers, it's mostly a different message than what it originated as, or somebody close to a problem emerging, trying to bring that up as far as they can in the organization to get action. It's too slow. It's too slow. It's got all sorts of errors in it. And so this model is one, you mentioned the name of it, Network Distributive Governance of a Commons. The distributive part is based on a model by John and Miriam Carver. That's called the Carver method of governance. Popular with a lot of nonprofits, but the basic, there's a lot to this, so I'm going to be very simple on it. The basic premise of the Carver model is that you set ends. So this is why the organization exists. This is why we've come together. These are the goals that we have. Those are the ends. And then you define the means, not by saying you can do this, but you say you can't do this. And anything you don't say, sorry, this is going to be a double negative. Anything you don't say that you can't do, as long as it's a reasonable interpretation of what the organization is trying to achieve, is permitted. So this is distributive authority, right? So I say as a board member, CEO, here's what we want you to achieve. Don't go outside of these boundaries. The CEO is then supposed to nest policies and goals inside of that as they hand them off to different levels of the organization. So eventually you get to the people who are initiating the risk taking. They've got a little bit smaller, what they call policy box. They're able to operate in a smaller world, but they're free to operate as long as they're within that box. So it's a nice model, but it has all kinds of agency problems. So agency risk is whenever you hand off something to somebody to do, they might do it differently than you want them to. They might act in their own self-interest. They might misunderstand you. There are all kinds of things that can happen that are in this, what they call principal agent problem. So Shan Turnbull, who's a researcher based in Australia, has written a lot about network governance and stakeholder governance. And really a great guy. I had a chance to meet Shan maybe 15 years ago. Just a fascinating guy. But he looks at how, and this goes back, I think, probably to 2008 or so, how you bring stakeholders into the governance model so that they can both provide input in terms of what they see. I mean, the stakeholders are capital providers. That's what they are. They're no different from financial capital providers. They are capital providers in all sorts of different forms. So they're not this sort of thing that's outside of our organization. They have a great interest in it. So you want to bring in their ideas. And then you also want to have a group of those stakeholders who can act as a veto board. In other words, they see the organization doing something that's not in their interest. They veto or can veto the policy of the board, which can then be overridden by another board. So there's this check. So that's the stakeholder part. So networked governance is what Shan talks about. Distributive governance is what the Carver model is. But again, we're still not quite there. And the most important one, and I might give this probably not enough text in the book, but it's the very end. It's sort of like if you've been to a fireworks show, it's when you get the big crescendo of all the fireworks, is work that Elinor Ostrom did. And Elinor Ostrom is an economist at Indiana University, Nobel Prize winning economist. And she talked about governance of commons and an economic governance of commons. And commons, for people who don't know, it's a short term for common pool resources. It's something that a lot of people have access to. The old model was one from Garrett Hardin, where the belief was if you have a commons, people will use it up quickly. They'll destroy it because they think, okay, if I don't use it up, someone else will. And so it might be air, water, grazing lands, whatever it might be. What Ostrom found, though, was that there's a model of corporate governance of these commons that's more effective than government regulation, which is what Hardin argued for, but more effective than the traditional corporate hierarchy of governance. And I won't bore you with all of the elements of it, but part of it is defining who has access. Part of it is making sure those people who have access set the rules. Part of it is the people who have access issue penalties for the people who abuse the rules. Part of it is being part of a larger ecosystem. It's another form of nested and distributive governance that builds on, honestly, the work of her husband and also some other people on this thing called polycentric governance, which is this idea that there are all sorts of different places where we have connected governance. And I know this is a much longer answer than you wanted, but the combination of these three gets us to the place where we have the confidence to give people the freedom to take risk. We have the confidence that we have the ability to respond to things that we didn't expect. We know that we're valuing the people who provide us with all their capital because they're part of our governance structure. And it honestly winds up being less cumbersome than the traditional hierarchical model that we have right now. And on this one note, part of my research too was looking at publicly traded companies in the United States, and I can consistently find better risk-adjusted performance when you can identify better governance. And that even people took a long time to believe, but now it's fairly common knowledge.
Absolutely. So to make sure we bring it together, that means that the new model you described is more flexible and adaptive. So then leaders can bring in also DEI, ESG, whatever other initiatives they might have, because the foundation is more fit for something like
it's requisite variety. That's the secret to a complex system surviving, is that you match it with a requisite variety in the governance of it. So it can be different in all kinds of places because of what people are seeing and doing. And it really is, it's very similar. Jeffrey West at Santa Fe Institute talks about why cities live for millennia, but companies tend to be like mammals. They grow quickly, level off, roll over, and die. Bart Madden's done some great work on value creation that looks at these same things. And when you start to see what they see in terms of innovation and the life cycle of companies, and then these governance, this new governance model, or these other governance models that I brought together, you see how companies can become successful for the long run at creating value and fulfilling their purpose. And if you can't be flexible, you won't survive this environment right now or the next 10, 20 years.
Is your award was for reinventing leadership. So far we explained the model and what it means for the board and the organization, but maybe can you share what characteristics do leaders need to be effective? You just mentioned a little bit the king is that, but so what type of new person do we need, and what are the behavioral characteristics if they want to reinvent themselves, if they want to embrace this model, what do they need to show?
So yeah, a bit of this idea of the king being dead is a starting point, and saying we're not ruling through that sort of authority, although we're seeing plenty of people try to do that in political systems. The central element to success in this is trust. And I'm going to give credit to a gentleman who I met up in Canada, and I mentioned him in the book, who used to run a company called Trust Enablement. And he and I don't remember how we got connected, but we sat down and we had a coffee in Toronto one day. We started talking about trust. And he talked about trust as two different things. One being a level of acceptable uncertainty. And the other one is a willingness to increase your exposure. To me, the best leader then, and the guy's name, I just make sure I give him credit, Alex Todd, was the best leader is one that understands how to foster trust everywhere in the organization and values trust as one of the, if not the most important commons in the organization. So there's trust internally and there's trust externally, and that trust internally breeds more innovation. The trust externally reduces the cost of all forms of capital, because people build trust based on their mind's projections of an expectation of what the future is going to look like and the future value of this relationship, or the current value based on future values that come to them that are uncertain. The more you create trust, the more certain those valuations become, and the less people need to be paid, whether it's for their equity investments, lending you money, their physical, intellectual capital, whatever it might be. So the leader of tomorrow is the one that understands how to build trust. And that probably takes a lot more emotional intelligence than people are emphasizing, although there's more of that today. It takes a greater understanding of how people have different attitudes towards risk. We all have different risk personalities. We work with a group in London that's modeling that stuff. And I work with board members and boards as a whole to help them understand the risk personality of their boards and their companies. These things help us to communicate with each other better because we understand the receiver in their attitude towards what we're talking about and try to put our words in the mindset of the person receiving our words. We're not always good at it, but that helps with communication, that helps build trust, that helps with collaboration. And as you know, we talked to you a little bit earlier here, the notion of what AI is going to be able to do in terms of collaboration is going to require trust.